Hey again. All right, so we're going to kind of start talking about the actual endocrine organs and the hormones that they secrete and what those hormones actually do. So we've set up the story. We've talked about what a hormone is. We've talked about how they're regulated, and we've talked about their structure, or what their chemical structure is. And just some days you can't make the pen work. All right, so we're going to focus today on this lecture on the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. All right, so we're going to go through each one of these endocrine organs and talk about what hormones they make and then where those hormones go and what they do. So this lecture's focused is on the hypothalamus and the excuse me, posterior pituitary. So just as a reminder, you should have learned a little bit about the hypothalamus when you covered the nervous system, because this is a structure inside your brain. And so if you remember, it's going to be below the thalamus. So right in the center of your brain, it's this little W-shaped structure inside the brain. And if you remember, there's an infundibulum, a stalk, that connects it to the pituitary gland. So they're physically in contact with each other, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So what is the hypothalamus, in case you've forgotten? It plays a key role in connecting the endocrine system and the nervous system. Some people will call it the brain's chemist. All right, so it's going to help you regulate electrolyte balance, water balance, things like that. And we're going to talk about how all this is going to work. It also plays a role in motivational behavior, like tells you when you're hungry and when you're thirsty. It plays a role in maintaining constant temperature. But what we want to focus on right now is its regulation and control of the pituitary gland. Okay, so we want to really focus on how the hypothalamus plays a role in regulating the pituitary gland. And when I say pituitary gland, we're going to focus on the posterior pituitary in this lecture. And then in another lecture, we're going to talk about the anterior pituitary. So if you look at the pituitary, it actually has two portions. There's the front, the anterior portion of it, and the posterior portion of the pituitary. So we're really just going to focus on the posterior in this particular lecture. All right? So I guess I'm going to say that again. So the pituitary gland, we call it the master gland because you're going to learn the pituitary gland does a lot. And so it's considered the master gland, but it has a master. The hypothalamus kind of regulates what the pituitary gland is doing. So you'll hear some people say the master gland has a master. So the master gland is the pituitary, but its master is the hypothalamus. And I just throw that in there because I've heard it all my life, and you will too. So I want to make sure that when you hear master gland has a master, you know what that means. So again, the pituitary gland is not just one gland, it's really two. And it's two because it's made up of different types of tissues. And so another word for pituitary gland is hypophysis. And so you may see the word hypophysis. And so the posterior pituitary, or lobe, is called the neurohypophysis. And the anterior pituitary, or lobe, is called the adenohypophysis. And so the posterior pituitary, because it's neurohypophysis, it's made up of neural tissue. So if you think about it, the posterior pituitary, there's a pouch, kind of an outpouching of neural tissue forms the posterior. So if you would look at it in the microscope, it looks like brain tissue. Okay, whereas the anterior pituitary, it's kind of a outpouching of some glandular tissue, kind of from the roof of the mouth almost. So it's anytime you see the word adeno, that means gland. So it's glandular tissue. So you're going to do some histology slides on endocrine, and you're going to see what the different glands look like. And so you're going to notice that the anterior pituitary looks a lot like the other glandular tissue that you're going to learn about throughout the semester. All right, so posterior pituitary is a neural tissue called the neurohypophysis, and the anterior pituitary is called the adenohypophysis because it's made up of glandular tissue. So they're completely separate types of tissues. So we're going to focus on the posterior pituitary now. So this posterior pituitary, again, it's a downgrowth, it's an outpouching of hypothalamic neural tissue, okay, and it's physically connected to the hypothalamus. There's an actual connection there called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, okay. The hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary, and this is one of the ways it does it. Inside the hypothalamus, you actually make the hormones that the posterior pituitary is going to release. Okay, and this is going to be a big difference between the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. We're going to have another lecture on it, but this is one of the big differences. So the posterior pituitary hormones are made in the hypothalamus, all right? And the hormones we're going to talk about are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which is known as ADH. It's also known as vasopressin, okay? So both those words describe the same hormone. So these are hormones that are made in the hypothalamus, and they're transported down axons into the posterior pituitary, where they're stored until they're needed. Okay, so again, this is very different than what happens between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, which you'll see that in a different lecture. So physiologically and anatomically, what does this look like? So here is our hypothalamus, that W. So you've got little what are called portions or areas of the hypothalamus, okay, these little hypothalamic neurons that make these different hormones. Some make antidiuretic hormone and some make oxytocin, okay. Once these are made, they're transported down these neurons in this hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. I'm losing my ability to talk. And so they're going to travel down these axons, and they're going to be stored. Okay, so they're just going to be stored inside these, inside the posterior pituitary. Now, in order for those hormones, because they're hormones, in order for them to get out into the blood, something has to happen. So when hypothalamic neurons fire, it's going to cause an action potential to arise at that axon terminal and release those neurotransmitters, or those hormones, into the blood. Okay, and that's how you release oxytocin and ADH into the blood. Real similar to how an action potential travels to the end of an axon and releases acetylcholine when you think about muscle contraction. So again, oxytocin, ADH, made in the hypothalamus, transported to the posterior pituitary where they're stored until they're released into the blood to go to their targets. All right. So there's only two posterior pituitary hormones. There's a lot of anterior pituitary hormones, but only two posterior, oxytocin and ADH. Remember, ADH is antidiuretic and vasopressin. Antidiuretic, you don't even know what it is, but just think about it, antidiuretic. That means it's going to have something to do with water balance, right? Well, this other part of the word, the vasopressin, that has to do with blood pressure control. And so we've learned that water balance and blood control, blood pressure control go hand in hand, right? So these hormones, if you're in the kidney side of medicine, you call it antidiuretic hormone. And if you're in the blood pressure side of medicine, the heart people, they call it vasopressin, but it's the same thing. Anyway, these oxytocin and ADH look very, very similar. They're peptide hormones. They're made up of 9 amino acids, so they're not very big. And they're almost identical. There's just a couple of differences between oxytocin and ADH. Other than that, they're just about the same. But those small differences make large differences in what they do. So what does oxytocin do? All right, it's a strong stimulant of uterine contraction. It's released during childbirth. It is needed for milk ejection, so to lactate, not to make milk. That's a different hormone, but this is to have milk let down in order for a mother to nurse her child. It also acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And remember, most hormones work by negative feedback. This is one of those positive feedback hormones. So you should have maybe learned about labor and delivery at one point. If you haven't, there's several parts of the book you can go and look up that and read more about how oxytocin affects the uterus. Basically what happens is when the baby is inside the uterus and it starts to drop and the uterine wall starts to stretch and you start to get those signals for that labor is getting close, oxytocin will be released and it causes the uterus to contract. And so then those uterine contractions cause the release of more oxytocin, and then that oxytocin goes to the uterus and causes the uterus to contract more, and that stronger contraction causes a release of more oxytocin, which goes back to the uterus and causes the contractions to get stronger and even more closer together. So positive feedback. the response, the uterine contraction, is actually causing the release of more oxytocin. And so childbirth just kind of builds. It starts off with a few contractions, a couple hours apart, more contractions closer together, stronger contractions closer together, until finally you get several really big, strong contractions and the baby is delivered. Positive feedback. Well, it also works for milk ejection. So when a mother is going to nurse a baby, it requires two hormones. Prolactin, we're going to talk about that. That's what makes the milk, okay? But the milk is going to be stored in the mammary glands, and it has to be let down and then released so that the child can suckle. And so what happens is you put the child to the breast, and the child will suckle. And this is going to stimulate nerve endings in the nipple, and this is going to carry a signal to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to go into the blood, travel to those mammary lobes and cause contraction, which will cause the milk to eject or let down so that the milk can be released. And so that's going to be humoral, hormonal, neural. What do you think? Neural. So you got a neural stimulation. That's how you're going to release oxytocin. Also, so it has an emotional bond as well. So you can, if you've been nursing a child, you can see the child, hear the child cry, and your milk will let down. Okay, so even without suckling, you're going to get a neural pathway, an emotional pathway to get that oxytocin released and cause that milk ejection. If you've ever been in the labor and delivery room, or you know someone, maybe they were given Pitocin, similar. This is an artificial oxytocin. You can give it to stimulate uterine contraction and kind of get things going if labor and delivery is stalled. So oxytocin is a hormone made by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and then released to cause either milk letdown or delivery. And it works by positive feedback. Antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, these are going to do things that prevent urine formation. Antidiuresis. So to diurese is to make urine. So to antidiurese is to not make urine. So it inhibits or prevents urine formation. So it's very important in regulating water balance, and as a result, also you use it to regulate blood pressure. And one of its targets is going to be the kidney tubules, and it allows you to reabsorb more water out of the urine so that you retain that water, so you make less urine. It can be released not only by changes in it's going to respond to changes in basically the osmolality of the blood, so kind of the saltiness of the blood. Do you need to hold on to urine and decrease how salty your blood is? It can also be released in response to pain and low blood pressure. If you have low blood pressure, you want to hold on to fluid, fill those blood vessels back up, right, and raise your blood pressure, and also some drugs. So here we have the hypothalamus, and so again, it's the brain's chemistry. It's measuring the chemistry of your blood, and so it's going to pick up that your blood saltiness, I like to use that word because it makes more sense to my students. They don't really know, don't have a lot of chemistry, so if I say osmoticity, it maybe kind of goes over your head. So just use the word salty. So you have salty blood, and so you want to thin that out. You want to add water to it, and so you want to do that. So your hypothalamus will tell your posterior pituitary to release that ADH that it's been storing. That ADH will go to the kidneys and cause the kidneys to reabsorb more water and therefore lower the saltiness of the blood. All right. In high concentrations, it will vasoconstrict, and so vasoconstriction can also help you increase your blood pressure. It's blocked. ADH is blocked by caffeine and ETOH, which that is the chemical shorthand for alcohol. And also diuretics. And so if you have been drinking a beer and you have to pee a lot, you think, well, it's not, sometimes you realize you're having to go to the bathroom more than the amount of beer that you drank. And that's because the alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. So if you inhibit antidiuretic hormone, you're going to diurese. You're going to go to the bathroom more. It's also the reason when you drink coffee, you feel like you've got to go to the bathroom more than maybe the volume of coffee that you drank. It blocks that anti-diuretic hormone. So again, remember, I'm kind of giving you these hints of things that you need to go back and think. What's the stimulus? Is this humoral? Is this hormonal? Is it nervous? So, think about this. I'm not going to give you all the answers because that's part of learning, is to go and research these things and find them. I'm just reminding you that you need to know that. So what's the hormone? What's its stimulus? What endocrine gland makes it? What's its target? What does it do? These are all things that you need to know about this hormone. All right, so when we cover hormones, we always want to cover disorders. And typically in the endocrine system, you're talking about too much or too little. So hypo is too little, hyper is too much. So in the case, there's not really any hyper or hypooxytocin ones. If you don't have enough, maybe your labor may be stalled, but that's when they'll give you Pitocin. But in ADH, there are two things that we can talk about. Diabetes insipidus. Okay, this is an underproduction of anti-diuretic hormone. So it's a deficiency, usually due to some kind of damage to the hypothalamus or posterior pituitary. And so these people have to be be kept well hydrated. They have a lack of anti-diuretic hormone. That means they diurese a lot. They make a lot of urine. And so I know that because the word diabetes is basically what that means is free-flowing urine. You're making lots of urine. So we use the word, you've probably heard of someone who's diabetic. That's talking about the diabetes that's based on the amount of sugar in your blood. And we're going to talk about these different types of diabetes. And it's called diabetes mellitus. Okay, so diabetes mellitus is what you guys have heard about when you've heard about diabetes. This is the one that has to do with sugar in the blood. Diabetes, and so this is going to be something that has to do with the amount of insulin. That's another hormone. Diabetes insipidus is not having enough anti-diuretic hormone. And so the word insipidus versus mellitus comes from the old-fashioned way of figuring out what kind of diabetes it was. So all you knew, you had a patient making lots of urine, but in order to figure out was it due to an insulin problem or an anti-diuretic problem, you had to test the urine. And so back in the day, they would just taste it. All right, so mellitus means sweet, like honey, and insipidus means not so good. Okay, so kind of bitter. So they would taste the urine, and so if it wasn't sweet, if you weren't spilling off sugary urine, they would know that it was diabetes insipidus. And because in both diabetes you have to keep well hydrated, but diabetes insipidus is going to be a not sweet urine, and they don't taste it anymore. They do a stick test now. If you have too much ADH, it's called syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, or SIADH. And this means you've got too much anti-diuretic hormone. So that means you're not going to be making enough urine. You're going to be retaining that fluid. And so you're retaining fluid. That can cause headaches. It can cause high blood pressure. It can cause you to be disoriented. It can cause electrolyte balance problems. And so that's hyper ADH, the syndrome with too much ADH. So just be prepared on your exam to be able to tell me, where ADH is made, where is it stored, what is it released in response to, where does it go, what does it do, and then know what happens if you have too much or too little. Okay? All right, that's the end of this one. The next video we'll be talking about the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Thanks a lot.